Thank you so much, Cantor.
Pleasure.
Good evening, everyone, and welcome. We're very happy to have you with us. And of course, we are sad for the reasons that bring us together. And while we wish we could be together in person, instead of on Zoom, we warmly welcome you to our virtual living room and hope that our time together brings you a small measure of comfort as you continue to mourn during these difficult times. My name is Diane Halivni. I'm the coordinator of community education at JCFS Chicago, and I will serve as our host. We want to extend our heartfelt appreciation to Scott Bauer. And if everyone could make sure their cameras are on mute. Thank you. Thank you. Great.
Yep.
So we want to extend our heartfelt appreciation to Scott Bauer and the board of the Lauri S. Bauer Foundation for Sudden Loss for their generous support of this program. The foundation was established by Lauri's friends and family in her honor to give help, healing, and hope to children and families that have suffered a sudden loss or crisis. Thank you very much to the foundation for helping us to support all of whom are grieving. Our plan for the evening is that we have special presenters with special thanks to Rabbi Joe Ozorowski. I'm so sorry, Anne. We're gonna have to change the slides. That's what I thought. I apologize to everyone. We're gonna need a moment. I think these were the past slides, but no problem, because I'll fill you in on our announcements while we get situated. Our plan for the evening is that we will start with a Dvar Torah from Rabbi Joe Ozorowski, and we will welcome Audrey Cantor to share her reflections on her grief journey. Following Audrey's reflections, my colleague Tracy Kite will discuss manifestations of grief and their impact on us this season. And then we'll have some quiet moments of reflection and invite Cantor Eugen Green to share her personal remarks and a little bit more about her own grief journey and share her experiences in founding a Chevra Kadisha, a burial society in her community. What we also like to offer after our formal program is finished at 8:30 is to invite people to stay on for small group discussion. Our staff, Rabbi Joe and Carol and Marcia, will facilitate some small group discussion. So you're welcome to stay on after, and that will be a time to share reflections together. And I think, oh, just some other guidelines. I know we always say, please keep your cameras on mute. We wish this was a better way and Zoom was more magical than it is. But we will be recording just the slides and the presenters, which is why we're, spotlighted in that way. So none of you will be recorded in our final recording, but we do like to record the program and share it with the rest of the community. And it lives on our website with all of our recordings from many of our past grief support programs. So I invite you to explore those at your leisure. We want this program to be meaningful and supportive as possible. And if anyone might want to speak to one of our staff during the program, you can go to the chat function and send a message to our dear friend Carol Brumer-Glickman, and she will connect you with someone to have a side conversation if you need, or if you have any other questions. And maybe Alyssa might need, I see a hand raised. I'm not sure if Alyssa may need a comment addressed. And so tonight we will learn more about our grief. And as the writer Helen Keller reminds us, we bereaved are not alone. We belong to the largest company in all the world, the company of those who have known suffering. We acknowledge that we are here for ourselves and we are here for one another. We hope that at the end of our time together, you will feel more connected and more held. Thank you again to the Scott Bauer and Lauri S. Bauer Foundation for helping us build this beautiful support community. So I now invite Rabbi Joe, as he's affectionately known, to share with us a Dvar Torah. Rabbi Joe is a board-certified chaplain and rabbinic counselor at JCFS Chicago. He serves the patients and families at Skokie Hospital and Glenbrook Hospital on a regular basis. And I would like to mention that calling JCFS and asking to speak to a chaplain, you can do that at any point in the life cycle. Anytime in your life that you might like to talk to someone or receive some more spiritual guidance, you can reach out to any one of the JCFS staff or Rabbi Joe or Carol and be connected to someone to speak with. Toda rabah, Rabbi Joe. Thanks for leading us off.
Thank you so much for that lovely introduction, Diane. And I want to thank all of you for coming here tonight. It takes a lot of courage to come and join an online group such as this. You don't know many of the people, quite possibly. You may not know many of the staff, and yet you came and you brought yourself and your feelings and your journey to join with us tonight. I hope that it will strengthen you. I hope it will offer you some sense of healing and some helpful tips perhaps as well as the idea of being with people who are with you on the same journey. I have a very brief Dvar Torah I'm going to share this evening. It comes from this week's Torah reading, which on the surface seems to have nothing whatsoever to do with the journey through grief and loss. It's the Parsha of Shlach, and it's a story which, if you're familiar with the Torah, it may be known to you. In the second year of our people's wandering through the desert, Moses decides to send spies to spy out the land of Israel, to see what it's like and bring back a report, and to prepare for the people's journey to the promised land. There are 12 spies, one for each tribe, and they come back with mixed reports. There's a majority report and a minority report. The majority of spies looked at the bad aspects and the difficult aspects, and they said, we can't do this. Let's go back to Egypt. We should appoint a new leader. It's better to be back in slavery, and we can't do this, and we're not going to do this. Because it was 10 out of the 12, it caused quite a ruckus among the people. In fact, it caused what we would call today a mutiny. The people decided, let's go back. This project of going to the promised land is not worth it. And God basically says, okay, Kinderlach, if you can't make it, maybe you need to spend another generation or two wandering in the desert. And this is the specific reason why our people wandered in the desert for a full 40 years. And there was loss and there was grief involved. In fact, that's the term the Torah actually uses. When the decree from on high came out, the term that's used, you can see it for yourself in Numbers chapter 14, verse 39, Vayit ablu ha'am ma'od, and the people grieved. and they mourned very much. The word vayit ablu is the exact same word that is used in Rabbinic Hebrew. It's used in all the classic works of Jewish tradition when it comes to grief and mourning, and it's used in modern Hebrew as well. There was grief, there was loss. They would be wandering in the desert, they would be dying in the desert. And yet, if you go to the next passage, when this narrative is over, there are two rather arcane legal passages, law passages. One having to do with something that we can't even relate to. It's the libations, the wine offerings and beverage offerings in the temple. We haven't even had a temple for close to 2,000 years, but at one time there were, and so that law is there. And then the law having to do with challah. When challah, we think of challah as the nice warm bread we eat on Friday night at a Shabbat meal, and the term is related to it, but it specifically refers to the offering of dough that was given to the priests in temple time. There's one remnant of this nowadays, and you may have seen your grandmother doing it, or maybe you did it yourself, where symbolically we still take a chunk of dough if we're baking a large batch of bread. And in tradition, we take a small amount of dough and burn it to remember the offering to the Kohan and to the priest that we can't do. These laws have nothing to do with grief and mourning. However, after the decree of wandering and the grief they experienced and what they had lost, these two passages open up with a stunning sentence. And I'm going to read it to you. I'm going to try to do it in such a way that you don't lose my speech through the speaker on the computer. God says to Moses, Daber el bnei Israel, speak to the Jewish people and tell them, Ki tavo el eretz moshvotechem, when you get to the land, asher ani noten lachem, which I am giving to you. And then the second passage, the one having to do with challah, opens up in a similar fashion. God to Moses, speak to the people of Israel, say to them, Tavoachem el haaretz, asher ani mevi etchem shama, when you get to the land, which I am bringing to you over there. So immediately after the decree that causes so much grief and mourning and hopelessness among the people, knowing that they are destined, the whole generation, to wander and end their lives in the desert, they are still told, you're going to get there. You're going to get to the promised land. It's coming, not just once, but twice. And I think the connection is intentional. God is reminding the people that no matter how bad things seem, you're going to get there. Where is there? You not even know where there actually is. But the journey is there. There is healing. It is possible. We can move along. We can't solve everything. We can't fix everything. And we can't make it the way it was. But we can still move ahead in life together. That is the promise. There will be a promised land. Where, when, what it will look like, we may not know these things. But it's there, and we can journey on that together. And I thank you very much for listening for these couple of minutes.
Thank you, Rabbi Joe. It is always meaningful to learn from you and with you.
Thanks.
I would now like to introduce Audrey Cantor. Audrey is a dear colleague of ours, a veteran social worker in the field who has worked in so many areas, supporting Holocaust survivors, older adults, individuals with memory loss and their caregivers, and is really an expert in so many topics. While Audrey is here wearing all of those hats and her own unique hat, she will speak to us tonight about her own complex grief journey, sadly grieving the death of her husband, Jack, who died in January of 2020, and only 6 months later, her beloved daughter, Sherry Feiner, who passed away in June of 2020. Audrey is a loving mother-in-law to Michael, grandmother to Sherry's 3 children, and continues to find her footing through her grief journey. We are honored to have you with us tonight. Thank you, Audrey, and welcome.
Thank you. In a previous JCFS community evening program such as this, Cantor Stephen Storr from Congregation Beth Shalom in Northbrook shared the words of Dr. Gerald May. Grief is neither a problem to be solved nor a difficulty to overcome. It is a sacred expression of love, a sacred sorrow. In May 2020, 4 months after my husband's unexpected death, and in the midst of my mourning this tremendous loss, I received a telephone call from my daughter, Sherry, letting me know that she was at Evanston Hospital being treated for pneumonia and would be home in a few days. This was the height of the pandemic, as we all remember, and no visitors were allowed. Sherry remained in the hospital for several weeks, not with pneumonia, but with lung damage caused by her most recent regimen of chemotherapy. Her condition deteriorated rapidly. For me, it was harrowing to live with the fact that my then 57-year-old daughter was fighting a losing battle for her life, and no one was with her to hold her hand or offer any support or love. She was truly on her own. Sadly, Sherry died on June 19th, 2020. Because of COVID restrictions, we were told that Sherry's funeral would be limited to a handful of people. But to their credit, many of my friends and Sherry's friends came to the cemetery anyway to say their last goodbyes and creating a sense of community, albeit from a distance. I could feel the love and support of everyone there and those unable to attend in person, but who joined us via Zoom. The days and weeks after remain a blur to me, even to this day. I lived each day in a state of sheer and utter chaos. The first days of Shiva took place in her family's backyard, and then I moved to my driveway and garage where it was easier for my friends to visit. We sat in masks, 6 feet apart, no hugs, no hand holding. My grief was my new best friend. I felt disoriented and isolated in a world without my loved ones. I experienced a grief that ripped my whole world apart. My whole life had been disrupted. The love and support of family and friends, even though from a distance, helped to get me through each day. But as time went on, I knew that if I only held on to the grief, I would become a shell of a person, not how I wanted to be and not how I wanted to honor my loved ones. I knew that I needed to take the first step. I began to meditate, practice mindfulness, and tried my hand at journaling. Although the world had literally shut down and there were few places to go, I explored various venues where I could walk outside, surrounded by the peacefulness of nature. Each day, I reminded myself of 3 things for which I was grateful. In the evenings, I reflected on the light my loved ones brought to my life and the fond memories I had of our lives together. I read countless books, most of which you will be receiving from JCFS's bibliography later this evening, trying to find words of wisdom to carry me through the day. Knowing that I was looking for something to propel me forward on my healing journey, a friend shared the Zoom link to her synagogue's Friday night services, where I found comfort and connection. The Shabbat rituals and familiar melodies touched me deeply. Being able to recite Kaddish surrounded by the rabbi and congregants brought me immeasurable peace. As a professional, I have always advocated for self-care, but it took a while before I heeded my own words and ventured down that path. I knew that my emotional well-being was tied into my physical well-being, and I embarked on a dedicated weight loss program and Zoom exercise program, both of which I continue to follow. These gave me the energy to do the inner self work I desperately needed. Attending these JCFS community healing programs has been a lifeline to me during these darkest of times. As I learned in these programs, grief comes in waves. It is exhausting. Some days my grief was more than I could bear, but I was reminded that we can't go over it, we can't go under it, we have to go through it. Grief is the tax we pay for loving someone. The pain is still there. It will always be a part of me like a scar on my heart. The recent death of my beloved brother-in-law, Norm, felt as though a Band-Aid had been ripped off of an open wound and served as a stark reminder that it's okay for me to have a meltdown as long as I don't unpack and live there. Rather, I need to cry it out and then refocus on where I am headed. Each day I remind myself that I'm doing the best I can for that day. I honor the grief and the memories of both my husband and daughter, and at the same time, do my best to live in the here and now. Some days are easier than others. To each of us joined together here tonight, I offer this prayer from Naomi Levy's book, To Begin Again. As we make our way through our busy and often lonely days, may our thoughts lead us back to times of smiles and laughter. May our tears and pain be eased by the comfort of our memories, and may God offer us strength and comfort now and always. Thank you.
Thank you, my dear Audrey, for sharing your extraordinary grief journey with us. We wish you continued good health and healing each and every day. At this time, my wonderful colleague, Tracy Kite, will share her thoughts with us about grief, some typical reactions. We're thinking we wanted to go back to basics to understand some of the core elements of grief that are so important to experience. Tracy has been a social worker at JCFS Chicago for 26 years. She has also worn many hats in the field. She has experienced her own grief in ways that she will discuss tonight. And she also is currently co-facilitating one of our monthly support groups for suicide loss. And we will have that information when we send our resources out to you. Probably not tonight, probably later in the week. Welcome, Tracy.
Tracy, you're muted, so I can't hear you. Can you unmute, please? Thank you.
Thank you very much. Wouldn't you think after almost 3 years that we would have this part down, but we never do. Good evening, everybody. Thank you for being here for yourselves. Thank you for being here for each other. My guess is that you're here grieving a variety of people. You know, it could be a spouse, it could be a sibling, it could be a parent, it could be a child, it could be a friend, a colleague, or someone else. And it may be, as Audrey described, multiple people. And while I'm sad about it, Audrey, your description of what it felt like when your brother-in-law died, that like bandage being ripped off felt so accurate. I often describe it as, you know, you've taken all your feelings and you put them in a box and you put the box on the shelf, and then it just gets all knocked down and you just start all over again. And you don't actually start all over again, but for a day or two, it can feel that way. Rabbi Joe, thank you so much. I loved your Devar Torah this evening. I've often loved different Devar Torahs that you give, but it felt so on target tonight, and I appreciate that. And Audrey, you and I have shared many stages, and I'm sorry that this is another one. So as Diane said, I speak tonight both as a clinician and someone who's experienced lots of people dying over the last probably 2 decades. This is not specifically my season of grief. I have one. But this year has been especially difficult because there have been some really unexpected waves of grief. And I love that we are using that image or that concept of water and waves. And that's really always how I talk about grief. And so when I get these unexpected waves, I will say to somebody like, I'm in a grief wave. In a way that I think is helpful to me to articulate, and also helpful to let other people know that that's where I am, right? And it doesn't mean I live there, but it means that, you know, I am feeling the pain of grief acutely in some way. And there are anniversary dates that we expect. So we know that a birthday, an anniversary, a holiday, things like that we sort of expect those to be grief waves. And then there are the ones we just don't expect at all. My dad would have turned 80 in May, and it didn't occur to me that that was going to be a grief wave, and yet it was. Suddenly I wanted to know what he would have been like if he'd lived these past 5 years. And, you know, I don't get to know that. My son came home from a Cubs game all excited, and he looked so much like his late dad that I was just taken back. You know, and there's the warmth of the memory at the same time as the pain of the loss. And it's that ratio that I think changes over time. I think at the beginning, the warmth of the memory is like this big, and the pain is like this. And then over time, it sort of shifts a little bit. Can we switch slides, please? Thank you. So Audrey actually referenced this, and this is something that I've talked about for quite some time, which is that grief is the tax we pay for loving someone. And it helps me always to remember that, you know, we pay taxes in proportion to what we've spent or what we have. And so the more intense the relationship, the bigger the grief, like the more it's going to hurt. And yet I'm absolutely willing to pay that tax to have had those relationships and to have had that love. I think Audrey did a great job of talking about how painful and exhausting grief is. And my experience as you talked was you were talking about how confusing it is. But of course, you know, when we're presenting like this, we sound so much more put together than we feel when we're experiencing it, right? Like there are mornings that you wake up and actually getting up and functioning in my day is not possible today, right? Like today is a couch day because that's all I got. And, you know, hopefully tomorrow will not be a couch day, and that's okay. And I love how you talked about self-compassion in there, although I'm not sure those were the words. There's no timetable for grief, and boy, do we wish there was. And the world tells us that there should be, because I think the world wants there to be. The world wants to know that this is something that they can measure out and know when we're done. And it just doesn't work that way. A, we're never done. And B, there are hard days, and then there are easier days, and then we go back to hard days again. And all of that is okay. Can we do the next slide, please? So what this really reminds me of, again, is something that Audrey referenced, which is this, We're Going on a Bear Hunt book, which, you know, I used to read to my kids when they were little. And in fact, was reading to them in the sort of season when their dad died. You know, we're going on a bear hunt. We're going to catch a big one. What a beautiful day. We're not scared. Oh no, a forest, a big dark forest. We can't go over it. We can't go under it. Oh no, we've got to go through it. And I think that that's what Rabbi Joe, your Devar Torah, really referenced was, you know, we're afraid. And grief can be scary if you don't know it. I will say that once you've done it once, it does get less scary because it's more familiar and you know that you've survived it. In fact, I was thinking as I was preparing tonight that one of the gifts of having survived a difficult grief is that we know we can survive hard things. And so when things like a pandemic come along, we know how to take things day by day, and that can really be a gift. You know, for some people, like as Audrey described, the loss, particularly of Sherry, was so impacted by COVID. And for some people at this point, I think the losses are very mixed. Your loved one might have died in the height of COVID when you couldn't get to hospital, or it could have been more recently and not so impacted. And so we just all have very different experiences. Next slide, please. So living during grief is painful and exhausting, and everything is just harder. But the first thing I always tell people when they're new in grief is grieving is the most exhausting thing I've ever done. And I raised twins. So like, it's a very different, there's a heaviness to it that is really, really hard. And then it comes with all this other stuff, like brain fog. And sometimes we call it widow's brain and we call it all sorts of things, but it really shakes our confidence in ourselves, right? Like, I was a confident person and now I can't find my keys to save my life or remember something or any of those things. And so that can be like really confusing and disorienting and scary, because if it's the first time you've gone through it, you don't know that it will eventually get better because you haven't lived through it in that way. Next slide, please. Grief leaves holes in our routines. And Audrey, you spoke to that so beautifully, of creating new routines for yourself, particularly if you were the caregiver for the person who died. Not only have you lost this person that you love, but you've lost your job. And it's very hard to figure out what to do in your day. It's very, as you talked about, very disorienting. And I love the way that you learn to structure your days. My mom, one of her things was every day she did something, whether it was an online class or walking, like whatever it was, but she had touchstones that she knew would help her get through each day. And I think that you spoke of that a lot. And the other thing that it upends is like the places that you like to go. So maybe it was the place that you love to take a walk with your loved one. And now that place becomes so laden with memories that some days it's really comforting and other days it's like a minefield. And it's not a good place for you to be. And you can't always know ahead of time. Can we go to the next slide, please? Thank you. Grief brings a lot of second guessing. I actually found this to be one of the more confusing and harder parts of it. What am I doing that I'm not supposed to be doing? What am I not doing that I'm supposed to be doing? And it's people, well-meaning, misguided people, fall into this all the time. Right? They want us to get better faster, or, they expect this. And sometimes I think we read expectations into what they don't even mean, because we're looking for those markers and because there is no roadmap, and that's really confusing. And I think with I'm going to call it the stage we're in with COVID. Some people call it post-COVID. I don't know if this is post-COVID, okay. But there are still so many decisions we have to make about where we go and where we feel safe and where we don't feel safe and where we wear a mask and where other people want us to wear a mask and all of those things. During a time where, like, whether or not you brush your teeth is sometimes the biggest decision you can make, or like making sure that you're going to eat something. And so it just feels like it layers on itself and it makes it really confusing. On the other hand, if you were somebody who just needed to lay on the couch for a couple of weeks, COVID can be really convenient because for a long time you really weren't supposed to go anywhere. Next slide. I can't remember what the next slide is. Yes. Okay. So grieving is lonely, and Audrey spoke to that as well. One of the things that I was thinking about this afternoon is how reticent people can be to talk about the person who's died, and how much we want to talk about them or want to hear them talked about, because they're still here. Like, their body's not here, but they're still here in our lives. We still have relationships with them, and they were important people to us. And so not only is it so comforting when other people talk about them, but we also, I think, have opportunities to be able to talk about them. One of the reasons I think that when you are at a place in your grief where you have space to hear other people's stories, that support groups can be so important, because it's an opportunity to talk about your loved one with other people who understand kind of what that feels like. So expressing your grief, incredibly important. And, you know, Audrey, my kudos to you to start a journaling practice. I always say journaling is one of those things that has been so helpful to me, and I never like it. And yet it has been incredibly helpful to me. And I remember at a certain point in my grief journey, when my husband died, just understanding that that was what I needed to do. And so my task every night was I had to write 3 sentences in my journal. And some nights that was all I wrote. And other nights that would get me going. And then it was a place that I could put up, you know, my thoughts, my fears, my whatever it was. So whether you talk to friends, whether you're in a group, whether you journal, I know JCFS has been offering some healing programs that involve art. And I understand there's one under construction, you'll excuse the expression, for August that doesn't have a date yet, but will be happening. And, you know, all of those ways to sort of let that out are so important. And again, Audrey was great about talking about physical care. Sleep for some people is like the most elusive thing. Rest, if you can't sleep, is kind of, you know, what I always think about. Eating healthy is so important, and getting exercise. Those are like crucial things. Next slide, please. Audrey also talked about books, and I too am a book person. And I know that particularly early in grief, the thought of following a book, like reading it and understanding it and following the storyline, is like beyond what people can do. I think that's why a number of books on grief are written. And this was all I could do at the very beginning. I could read a blog post about grief, and there are now lots of people write blogs. When I was first widowed, which was about 10 years ago, they were around, they weren't everywhere in the way that they are now, but I would read 1 or 2 every morning. And it grounded me in knowing that I was part of a larger community of people who was going through this, as I then went out into my day and didn't see other people who were going through what I was going through. And so I think that books and blogs, listening to things on tape, listening to podcasts, anything that helps connect us to the larger community and reminds us that we are not alone. And I know that there will be resources going out to you later. Last slide, I believe. Yes. So as I said, grief has always reminded me of waves. And at the beginning, those waves were 10 feet tall, and they came one after the other, right? Like I was always trying to grab some air in between. And then over time, so slowly that I only recognized it in retrospect, they were 9-foot waves, and there was a foot in between, and 8-foot waves, and there were 2 feet in between. And this is one of the reasons that I talk about this in terms of healing in a lot of different ways, but it is much more useful to compare yourself to where you were than where you want to be, because you don't know where you're going to get. Grief will, in some ways, if you're lucky, change you, right? Break you open and allow you to grow in new ways. And we don't know what that's going to be. But we can look back to where we were a week ago, a month ago, 6 months ago, and recognize that usually it's better. Like there may be still some days in there that are like the beginning, but in general, you can string more functional days together than you could at the beginning. I think this might have been the quote that was up at the very beginning, but sometimes the water is calm and sometimes it is overwhelming. All we can do is learn how to swim, right? And I think about, and get to Pirkei that talks about, you know, the things that parents must do for their children. And one of them is teach them to swim. And, you know, the Jewish tradition has amazingly important traditions around grief and mourning that really do match up with grief stages and what's helpful in grief. And so, you know, yet again, Jewish tradition is so helpful. So I always want to remind people, like, no matter what it feels like now, it's going to get better. It will not feel this way forever. And just because it doesn't hurt so much doesn't mean that your relationship with your loved one is less. It just means that there's more sweetness in the memory than there is pain. And what an amazing gift that is. And I think that's all I have. It's really just lovely to connect with people as much as one connects on Zoom.
Thank you so much, Tracy. It's really, I always learn so much from you each time. And I love how you're able to make concepts that feel very hard to understand much more digestible. So I know we very much appreciate your contributions tonight. So what I'd like to do now is ask you if you have a photo of your loved one or loved ones that you'd like to look at or reflect upon, or if you'd like to close your eyes and bring the image of your loved one into your mind's eye. In Judaism, we say, may their memory be for a blessing. You can say your loved one's name quietly or silently. Consider the ways in which they have inspired and influenced you. This is their legacy. Is there a sweet memory you can recall? A memory that warms your heart with gratitude or brings a soft smile to your face? Can you breathe in the warmth and allow the gratitude to grow? While the sadness may soften you at times, you may also allow yourself to feel the sparks of joy, to feel the gratitude of everything that your loved one has brought to your life. You will continue to honor your loved one and all that they brought to you. And may your loved one be the source of your life's blessings, and may their memory be for a blessing. I would like to invite Cantor Julie Eugen Green to take us to this next step of some song, of hearing another reflection of a grief journey. Rabbi Eugen Green has served the Oak Park Temple since 1997. She's instituted dynamic programs of music and study, engaging learners of all ages. And she was a founding member of the West Suburban Hever Kadisha, the Jewish Burial Society, whose members prepared the deceased for burial, according to Jewish tradition. Thank you for being with us tonight, Cantor, and welcome.
Thank you. It's such an honor to be here with all of you, and thank you for inviting me to participate. I had been a cantor for a handful of years before I experienced deep grief myself. I had officiated funerals. I had sat with families in hospitals, in final vigils with people. I had the honor of being with families when their loved one died, reciting Vidui, the final confession, and saying all of these, saying many, what I believe to be comforting things to families as they were experiencing loss. And I still think that what I was saying in those days, I hope they were comforting, but I didn't really understand these words and the things that I was doing until I experienced sudden grief myself. I'd like to begin with, well, I've just been reflecting on what Audrey said and what's been said a few times already this evening about how if you have love in your life and you experience the joy of companionship and love, eventually you're going to have pain because of it. eventually there will be loss. And I think that that is a hard pill to swallow, and yet I will swallow it. I don't believe that we would change a moment of what we had with our loved ones to lessen our pain, even though our pain is so deep. What we've heard and what we've said over the past hour, 45 minutes or so, is that this is a tax. This is a price we pay for having love in our lives. And if we didn't have it, we would be alone. And then, okay, we wouldn't feel the pain, but then we'd be alone. And is that what we want? And I would venture to say that all of us would most likely say no to that. No, that's not what we would want. We'll take the pain so that we can have the love and the companionship. It's worth it, but boy, oh boy, it hurts. I have a song that I'd like to share, a brief song called Behita Teif by Daphne Rosenberg of the Israeli group Nava Tehillah. This is a beautiful verse from the book of Jonah, chapter 2, verse 8. Behita teif alai nafshi et Adonai zacharti, vatavo elecha tfilati el hechal kodshecha, which means when my heart grew faint upon me, I remembered Adonai, and my prayer came to you, to your holy temple. And what this says to me is that when I am feeling despair, and in my grief, I have felt despair, and that is a frightening feeling. The thought that Adonai, and Adonai can mean many things to many people. It can mean God, it can mean community, it can mean other members of our family. There's no wrong way to do it. That whatever comforts us is there for us, but we need to be able to figure out how to find it when we are in the belly of the whale, which can be how we feel when we're in deep grief. This is Behita Teif. Behita Teif alai nafshi et Adonai zacharti. 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 Vatavo elecha tfilati el hechal kodshecha. Vatavo elecha tfilati el hechal kodshecha. Behita teif alai nafshi et Adonai zacharti. Behita teif alai nafshi et Adonai zacharti. So, as I mentioned, I had been a cantor for a while, sharing words of comfort to members of my congregation before I experienced deep grief myself. My parents were involved in a car accident a couple of decades ago, and my mother died. And I believe that there is a special kind of cruelty with a sudden death, just as there is a special kind of cruelty with watching someone we love fade over time and lose them little by little. The cruel grief and the complicated grief that I and my family suffered over my mother's death was that it was such a shock. And I do believe that a shock like that can change the neural pathways in your brain. And it did, it changed me. And I was disoriented for a while afterwards. I felt like she was lost and I just couldn't find her. I was very, very confused. And at the same, and in grief, we feel these things because our world turns upside down when our loved one is no longer there beside us. The world just gets twisty and turvy and turny, and time becomes very bendable, and it's very, very disorienting. But I also remember something that even all of these years later, I still feel awed by. When my mother died, I said to my husband that I felt in complete awe that somebody who was so close to me, and my mother and I were very close, we spoke every day. It was awesome to me that somebody I knew who was so close to me now knew. And that's where the thought sort of ended in my mind, that she knew whatever it was there is to know. All of these questions that we have, why are we here? What happens after we die? What is our purpose? Things like that. These big, big questions. Now my mother knew. And that's not a Jewish thing that I felt. That's just something that I felt and was awed by, that now my mother knew. And I still feel that. I still feel awed by that. And I still feel her presence with me. And I believe that she knows whatever there is to know. She knows. And I think to myself, and someday when I die, I'll know. And she and I will talk about it. And again, that's not a Jewish thing. That's just something that I believe. And it's something that I find comforting. So there's a member of my congregation. Her name is Barbara Brotman. And she is retired now, but she was a columnist for the Chicago Tribune. And about 15 years ago, she wrote a column about the progressive Chevra Kadisha, a group of volunteers that come together when someone dies and prepares the deceased for burial and says prayers for them and psalms and washes them and dresses them in tachrichim and shrouds and places them in the aron, in the casket. And that the family knows that this is going on, although they don't know who is involved in this ritual called tahara, but the family knows that their loved one is not alone. And I read this article that Barbara wrote, and I thought, someone did this for my parents. At this point, my father had also died. And I thought, someone did this for my parents. Somebody, I don't know who, but somebody had their hands on them, washing them, saying prayers over them, with them. And I just felt such gratitude to these unknown people. And I decided I want to do this. And so I founded the Chevra Kadisha of Oak Park Temple and West Suburban Temple, which is the conservative shul right across the street from us in River Forest. And that's what we do when a member of our congregation dies or a loved one of a family member dies. We go to the funeral home and we prepare their loved one. We prepare a member of our community for burial. And when I have my hands on the person who has died and am washing them and dressing them and saying prayers over them, I remember that someone did this for my parents. And I am again overcome with gratitude that our community takes care of one another in this way. And I'm just grateful that we have this, that we're able to provide this service for our community. I in all of the years that I've been a Cantor, and I've been a Cantor for well over 30 years, being a member of the Chevra Kadisha is hands down the most meaningful thing I've ever done. And I believe that I honor my parents every time I participate in a Tahara. So for myself, in my grief, even though the grief, the shock of it has softened, I still feel my mother with me, and I still talk to her, and I believe she hears me. And I ask her for guidance. And if I'm going through something difficult, I will say, Mama, what should I do? And I believe she hears me, and I don't know why I believe that. It's not a Jewish thing. It's just a me thing. I just believe it. And if we can feel the person that we have loved, that they have not just disappeared, they can still hear us, and we can still have them as a part of our life. The grief is still there. It is a companion in our life, but it is a part of us, rather than something that is just a hole, a dark place. It can deepen us. It can help us have empathy and understand when others are feeling pain. I don't know if any of you have experienced things like this, but I certainly have, that well-meaning people will say things that they hope are comforting. They'll say, well, you'll give it some time and you'll have closure. I cannot stand that word, closure. Or they'll say, well, your loved one is no longer in pain. Or God has a plan and we're just not meant to understand it. There's no way for us to understand it. These kinds of things are meant to comfort us, but I don't think they work. I really don't. I think we have to find our own way with the help of friends, with the help of family, with the help of community, being able to reach out, always to be able to reach out and ask for help when we're feeling the way Jonah felt in Behita Teif, in the belly of the whale, this despair, that we can reach out and the help is there for us. It is there to guide us, to help us grow, to help us understand how we're different now. And I hope that we can all remember that our loved ones add to our lives and can continue to add to our lives, even when they're no longer physically beside us. There's a beautiful poem by W.S. Merwin called Separation that I believe speaks to this idea that even when we are in deep loss, our loved one is still moving through us in a very, very real way. Your absence has gone through me like thread through a needle. Everything I do is stitched with its color. Our loved ones are with us, even when they're no longer beside us. And our pain is there. Our pain is real. But our pain allows us to have empathy and understand what others are going through. And our pain also speaks to the deep love that we had and still have. And I wouldn't change a moment of what I had to lessen my pain now. Thank you for allowing me to be here with you this evening.
Thank you so much, Cantor. A beautiful grief journey and finding meaning in our despair. And I want to just wish everyone who has presented and everyone who is here on the program a blessing, a Misha Berach prayer that some of our colleagues in an activity where they were invited to create their own Misha Berach, which also may be something that you come to want to write about as you consider journaling or writing a song or writing a prayer. This is a Misha Berach that was written, I believe, yes, last year, a Misha Berach for grief. To the one who blessed our ancestors and the one who blesses all beings here on earth. Bless you who are suffering the grief of someone you love. May you find solace in their memory. May your love find a resting place in your hearts. Bless all those who are struggling with the death of someone with whom you had a difficult relationship. May you find compassion for themselves. May you find compassion for yourselves and a renewal of spirit. May you have patience and strength as grief can come in waves throughout your lives. May you find the courage to share your grief with others, like tonight, no matter how recent or how many years have gone by. While you can be shattered by loss, you can be healed by love from others. Sacred One, help us all find ways to open our hearts to love and hope. Bless all those who are grieving, for it is an honor to have lived. Make both life and death a blessing. Again, I want to thank everyone for being together tonight, to our presenters for their beautiful words, and to invite you, if you'd like, to stay on for a few more minutes. If I could figure this out, I will create some breakout rooms that Rabbi Joe and Marcia, our amazing grief and loss staff, will give you a chance to say hello to each other, to tell us a little bit more about your own grief journey, and to hear more about JCFS and ways we might be able to support you. Of course, we also have an evaluation that we will send out with lots of resources, a bibliography, copies of the slides and the poems from tonight, and our materials that we hope you will come to reflect on over the coming weeks and months. And we just thank you for being with us tonight and for holding us all together in your hearts. So I'm going to take a moment to do that. And actually, Cantor, if we might invite you to close with Oseh Shalom while I'm doing some mechanics.
Sure.
Thanks again. Thanks
prayer,
again.
A prayer for peace. Oseh Shalom, Shalom, Bimrama, Uyaseh Shalom, Aleinu, Ve'al kol Yisrael, V'yimeru, Amen. Uyaseh Shalom, Aleinu, Ve'al kol Yisrael, Amen. Amen. Oseh Shalom, Shalom, Bimrama, Uyaseh Shalom, Aleinu, Ve'al kol Yisrael,
Thank you. If you're ready to say goodnight, we wish you a pleasant evening. And I will invite anyone who likes to wishes to stay to attend our breakout discussions. And Marcia and Rabbi Joe can tell you more about our programs and be with you a little bit longer. I'll be here if anybody wants to hang out with me. Laila Tov.